Mick, hello. Thank you for joining me.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very, very much indeed for having me.
And thank you also for writing a couple of books that, yeah, I guess tell a similar story in two quite different ways. One of which is recently published, the Nirvana Express, but was also touching on some of the stories I'd encountered from a slightly different perspective. Must be getting on for 25 years ago now. The Spiritual
I'm very
Tourist,
on this.
subtitled A Personal Odyssey Through the Outer Reaches of Belief. And I was, dipping my toe into one of those at the time I picked this up. I was on my second trip to India. I found this in a bookshop there and brought
Oh,
it home with me. Yeah,
oh, well, that's
price,
great. I'm really pleased it was available there.
yeah, price tag on the back says Penguin India. So
I never saw the royalties.
no, I know the feeling. But yeah, so I've got a similar sort of curiosity. I was at the time working as a journalist. I went to the Kumbh Mela in 2001, and
Mhm.
on my way back from there, I was trying to pick up all sorts of interesting material that would help me to make a radio documentary based on some interviews I'd done with people. And that documentary is still sitting on some mini discs that never quite got converted into a finished
Right.
product. But reading your book gave me a whole new perspective on, some of the historical context, I think, to something that I was
Oh,
still, not very aware of, particularly things like the Theosophical Society and the influence of, Western occultism on the spread of ideas from the East to the West. And that's
yeah,
really where, the sort of meat of the story comes from in the more recent book, the Nirvana Express, talking about
it is.
subtitle there is How the Search for Enlightenment Went West, through a fascinating cast of characters is the
Right.
short version of the story. And
Can I just
it's
interrupt now? Can
please,
we
please.
interrupt? What was the Kumbh Mela you were at? Was that at Haridwar?
So that was at Allahabad in
Oh,
2001.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
I, I went to Kumbh Mela in Haridwar, and I can't remember now whether that was before Allahabad or before, probably after,
They
I think.
yeah, they usually come, I think, 3 years before in Haridwar and then 3 years later in Allahabad. So yeah,
What an extraordinary event that is, isn't
it is indeed. Yeah.
it?
I mean, I was looking for ways to try and make sense of the experience, I suppose, afterwards, because there wasn't, it was a combination of a kind of medieval religious carnival, something like the Field of the Cloth of Gold, with goodness knows what going on, and then some sort of, kind of fun fair almost with,
Yeah,
attractions and rides.
exactly. I vividly remember walking through a Sado encampment,
Hmm.
which seemed extraordinarily large, with all the pavilions and the fires burning and sadhus sitting around and so forth. And I was suddenly struck that I was the only person there wearing trousers, and that kind of took me aback slightly. But and in profoundly moving. I mean, I always find displays of faith profoundly moving, and I found that profoundly moving as well. So truly extraordinary, truly extraordinary.
When did you first go to India? That's one of the things that's always been a bit of curious question for me at the back of it all, because you obviously got a long-standing interest in these subjects. But
Well, I had a long-standing interest before I actually went. Yeah, I mean, I was quite
hmm,
late going to India. The reason I first went to India was, in fact, to interview the Dalai Lama,
hmm.
um, and that was for a piece for Esquire magazine. I was asked by Esquire to go and interview the Dalai Lama. Um, but I'd had friends who'd gone to India uh, long before that on the so-called hippie trail. One of my closest friends went out there in about 1972, I suppose, 71, 72, and became a very ardent disciple, is the right word, of Sai Baba.
Yeah.
Uh, and so we'd correspond about that. And in fact, he then went on from India to Australia, so I barely saw him again after that, other than when he would occasionally come back here. Um, so there are a number of things that sort of engaged my attention about that world, and about Indian spiritual teachings, and then a little later on Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism. But I think probably all this really begins for me anyway, and it's a period I write about in the Nirvana Express. It's that period in the late '60s, when emerging out of the sort of music culture, drug culture, the hippie culture, for want of a better word, and I was sort of marginally a sort of a part of that, but very much turned on to writers like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, the Beats. Then the involvement in musicians I was interested in, people like Pete Townsend, following Mayor Barber, John McLaughlin, following Sri Chinmoy. So just the way that the East seemed to be impressing itself very strongly on the West and on Western youth culture, of which I was a part. So that, I think, is what first engaged my interest, certainly.
And did you yourself at that time start then reading anything from Eastern sources as opposed to Western interpreters of Eastern ideas?
Probably very little. No, very much Western interpreters of Eastern ideas. I'm sure I read Evans Went's Tibetan Book of the translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. A book that made a big impression on me was Alan Watts's autobiography. And I read quite extensively into Alan Watts and was very engaged by him. Thought he was a really interesting character. One of the books that I look at in the new book is The Razor's Edge, the Somerset Maugham book, which of course was predates the sort of the hippie interest in India, and it's a story about a very disillusioned young man living in America, a pilot in the First World War, who goes off to India in search of himself, and goes to an ashram, and actually based on Somerset Maugham, to a large extent on Somerset Maugham's visit to Ramana Maharshi, at least the background and the texture of that is. But that, interestingly enough, was not at all a book that was being talked about in the 60s, whereas Hermann Hesse was. Somerset Maugham, who'd written probably the first book, I think, about a Westerner going east in search of enlightenment. That wasn't discussed, I guess, because Somerset Maugham was very much he was an Edwardian figure, really, and the way in which that book was written is not designed to, in terms of its literary style, seems quite mannered and quite arcane. But I thought it was very interesting when I returned to that book to see how important that book might well have been had more people been aware of it. Although I was interested to see that reading correspondence between Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac, that Cassidy talks about having read The Razor's Edge, but not being very impressed by it, I'm afraid to say.
Really? Well, I suppose it wasn't as racy as some of the other things. Yeah.
No, well, that's true. Yeah, racy it's not, but I'd recommend it actually as a book. It's a really terrific book, really interesting book. Yeah,
I agree. I found it fascinating, and even the movie isn't bad, and so obviously it reached Hollywood, and
yeah,
piqued some curiosity there.
Yeah, I think it was quite a big hit at the time. But there was a remake with Bill Murray.
I've not seen that one. Yeah, I noticed that in the book.
Somehow passed me by. But what particularly interests me about the Hollywood version is this fantastically sort of romanticized version of the Guru, who actually, of course, the film looks nothing like Ramana Maharshi, and looks rather like a sort of a rather anglicized version of the Guru, with sort of wonderful sort of wispy grey hair and sort of ethereal air, which wasn't Ramana Maharshi. Yes, more Gandalfian than Ramana. That's very true.
Well, one of the things that struck me reading about that again through the storytelling in the Nirvana Express, and I really want to compliment you on the storytelling. You've got a really nice way of weaving all of these accounts together and showing actually the interconnected threads. So suddenly, we've gone from the late 19th century to the late 60s, following this roller coaster of characters all sort of handing on a baton to each other. But looking at Somerset Maugham meeting Ramana Maharshi, and he'd obviously gone there expecting something, and he wasn't that impressed, it seemed. He then wrote this book that sort of suggested that he had been touched on some deeper level, and obviously there was something about the experience that mattered to him. But you summed it up saying he wasn't devotee material.
No, well, I don't think he was devotee material particularly. Although there was this extraordinary sort of postscript to that in a meeting with Christopher Isherwood sometime afterwards, he talked about how he would like to write a book about Vedanta and about the Vedanta saints, and sort of almost sort of saying, perhaps he should go and live in a monastery. And Isherwood was very, very impressed by that. But then Isherwood met somebody the next day who said that Somerset Maugham had been sort of pouring scorn on the whole enterprise. And, I think he was a very complex, very interesting, but very complex and sort of conflicted character. But one of the things that interested me about his account of that, and if you read an extended essay that he wrote called "The Saint," where he describes the meeting in some detail, was that he'd been told about Ramana Maharshi by somebody at a drinks party, I think in Chennai, as now is Madras, as was then. And so he drove down to investigate, and he met this rather extraordinary man named Major Chadwick, who was a former English soldier who had become a devotee of Ramana Maharshi and was living there, and had this conversation with Chadwick. And then Somerset Maugham fainted and was taken into into Chadwick's little room where he lived. And Ramana Maharshi came to see him, and they had this sort of non-conversation, which passed for some time. As a result of him having fainted, the word seemed to spread that Somerset Maugham, rather than just fainting, had been overcome in the mysticism and the splendor of Ramana Maharshi, and had had a full-blown mystical experience, as it were, thanks to Ramana Maharshi. And he was forced to explain that actually regrettably, this wasn't the case, that he had a medical condition that meant he was susceptible to fainting. But what's interesting is the fact that Maugham, I think, had gone to India specifically to seek out what you might call the Indian religious experience. He hadn't gone there in the way he'd been. He traveled to extensively throughout Southeast Asia, writing about rubber plantations and all sorts of things, and colonial life in a rather disapproving way. But he'd gone to India to explore that religious terrain, and he'd visited temples, and he'd gone out of his way to meet swamis and to meet yogis. So I think he was. I honestly do think he was looking for something, and I don't think he found perhaps what he was quite looking for. But nonetheless, I think he was very moved by India and by the religious life of India, even if he didn't immerse himself in it.
The thing that struck me as well was both the characters you mentioned, Chadwick and Christopher Isherwood, were I think also via Isherwood's association with Prabhavananda, the Vedanta Society chap in California, a
Yes.
little bit critical of the way Maugham portrayed some of the philosophy and also teaching of Ramana Maharshi and Vedanta more broadly, as if to say he hadn't really understood it. He had this sort of writerly pretense to have engaged with it in a way that he didn't really. And in fact, this philosophy that he sort of wrote into his portrait of Ramana had to be corrected extensively to stop him making a fool of himself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he had the good grace to sort of consult Isherwood about it, and Isherwood took exception to the title as well, that Maugham had sort of misunderstood what the razor's edge actually meant.
Yes.
But I think, I mean, to sort of refer to a title of an earlier book of mine, I mean, I think a lot of the people that I write about were in one way or another spiritual tourists, and they were people who went to India intrigued, in search of something, but without really ever fully immersing themselves in it. I mean, Chadwick certainly did. I mean, Chadwick gave up his life to live with Ramana Maharshi. But I think Maugham was too much the spiritual tourist, or too much. He was too much the novelist to give up the world, give up his rather lovely house in the south of France, and all his friends and the comforts that he was accustomed to. But I think that's all right. I can't find it in myself to be at all. Maybe because it reflects something of my own attitude or posture towards it. I can't find it in myself to criticize people who dip their toes into it, and I think in many ways they're all the better for it. I said a little bit of learning is a dangerous thing, but I think in some cases a little bit of learning can actually put you on a path to a lot more learning, and can be a very positive thing.
Yes, and I think also, from the point of view of building bridges, it's these dabblers in a way, who are the sort of networked types who spread the news.
Absolutely.
Whereas the full timers, they just throw away the passport and forget about the world they came from.
And we never hear from them again. um, I've been thinking about this in the context of the East India Company, which of
Mm,
course is now the subject of a great deal of sort of revisionism, as it were, a great deal of criticism, a
mm,
great deal of hostility, much of it no doubt warranted. Um, but at the same time, I think in this rush to condemn, what is also forgotten, or what is forgotten, is that it was people from the East India Company who were largely responsible for initially bringing so much uh, Hindu wisdom, for want of a better word, to the West. I mean, it was Charles Wilkins, who went to India as a writer for the East India Company, who did the first Western translation, English translation, I should say, of the Bhagavad Gita.
mm.
William Jones of the Asiatic Society, who wrote extensively about Hindu practices. Any number of people. The East India Company wasn't entirely comprised of chancers, mercenaries, cutthroats, and greedy merchants. I think there were people of considerable erudition and learning who came with a completely open mind, eager to learn about the world in which they were now living, and made an immeasurable contribution to actually enlightening the rest of the Western world about that.
I agree. And, the term that was used to describe what they did has itself become a pejorative label. They were the Orientalists. They were studying Eastern traditions from a Western perspective, and yet they really wanted to study them. They wanted to understand them on their own terms. They, went to great lengths to learn Sanskrit and other native languages. And, it's thanks to their skill and scholarliness that, the whole discipline of Indology was established. And the
Exactly.
same methods are still being used. So,
Yeah.
that doesn't really have the same connotation as the word Orientalism acquired by Edward Said,
No.
of pure exploitation. Although the problem is that the guys who were very sincere were, being used by the guys who were more opportunist, should we say,
That's true.
for the possibilities that a greater understanding of culture would provide for those who want to govern over a large swathe of territory with a rather thin occupation force. So
That's true. No, all of that is true. All of that is true. But nonetheless, when I wonder how long without Wilkins, one would have had to wait for an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita.
exactly,
Um,
yeah. And perhaps that centrality of the Bhagavad Gita in Indian contexts wouldn't exist were it not for the international interest in it. I mean, it obviously was an influential text, but
yeah.
because it was singled out and because it also attracted so much interest, it was an easy way, I think, for subsequent reformers to kind of unite behind the idea of a book, given that that's what the
Yes.
Western occupiers were so obsessed with, and to
Yes.
try and suggest that there's a connecting thread there. So the Upanishads get prioritized, the Gita also, but all of these other aspects of Hindu tradition start to get kind of left by the wayside, and particularly cast out by a lot of people was the tantric traditions. Which
Yes.
had an enormous influence on Hindu ritual and also on the development of yoga, which ironically enough became the main feature of Western interest towards the end of the 20th century. So it's a complicated process, I agree. But I guess, coming back to sort of some of these characters and what they're doing, it's the fact that a lot of them don't actually necessarily even go there to acquire information and yet still have an influence that's really striking. The
Hmm.
first guy in the book, Edwin Arnold, who's prose poem almost about
Yeah.
the Buddha. It basically seems to be this baton that gets passed on from everybody thereafter as the sort of gateway drug to exploring Indian tradition. And even Mohandas Gandhi, when he first discovers the Bhagavad Gita, is reading Arnold's version of that rather than
Exactly.
reading it in his own native language in an Indian context. So that's, I
Yeah.
guess, the
I
backdrop to me making those comments.
Exactly. I mean, I think these transactions are really, really, really interesting. And I mean, something else which I have a sort of bit of a fixation on, the idea of cultural appropriation, um,
Mm.
uh, which is again, regarded as a very, very bad thing. But I think I mean, I would ask you about this. I mean, would you regard your student of yoga, an authority on yoga, would you regard what you have done as an act of cultural appropriation?
Well, I think there would be no culture without appropriation, because ideas are constantly being borrowed, exchanged, often without acknowledgement, and leading to all sorts of distortions that get covered up, and that's how ideas are shared, and that's how they change, and that's how they spread
Mm,
around the world. Um,
mm,
I think there is a particular context, specifically in the yoga world, that one has to be aware of, which is that colonial history and the ways in which certain presentations of ideas were prioritized as a result of colonial occupation. And partly that led to, the demonization of physical yoga practice and then the rehabilitation of it as a way to sort of resist colonial rule. That led to the combination of yoga with other forms of exercise and actually gave the world the kind of yoga practice that we now know. But that
mm.
probably wouldn't have existed in the form that it does without that sort of fusion of influences.
Right.
Um, and so I can see why some in India get a little bit annoyed when they see, exploitative-minded white Westerners cashing in a big way on
Right.
things related to yoga, disrespectfully, with very little knowledge of actually what comes from where, with a desire to say, "Oh, we're airbrushing out all of the Hinduism, basically for the most part." That's
Right.
Hindus who are getting annoyed. Um, and of course, that also ties in with Hindu nationalism, and that's still sort of dealing with the wounds of colonialism almost a century on. And so I think there is a context there that a Western yoga student with any degree of sincerity needs to be mindful of. But having
Sure.
said that, I don't think that should lead anybody to give up teaching yoga or to, beat themselves over the back with a set of twigs every time they say something slightly out of step. I think it should encourage us to study and to be aware of how things fit together. And the first thing you
Mm,
learn when you study the history of yoga is that it's appropriation right, left, and center. There's no
absolutely.
one true yoga from which everything sort of descends or from which others deviate. There's just this endless process of cross-pollination and borrowing and disguising of influences and pretense that things come from one place when actually they come from somewhere completely different. And
Mm,
also, in the 20th century, a lot of commercial mindedness, and some of that, very much on display from very sincere Indian teachers who are trying to establish, the business of making a living, offering a
sure.
public service in the way that we would now recognize. So, I don't think anything that we're grappling with now is necessarily new. I just think there is this sort of, I guess, cultural moment in which there is rightly so, a degree of greater sensitivity to the legacy of colonialism, and I think it's healthy to take that on board. But I think there is also at the same time fixation on this phrase, cultural appropriation, which is very misleading because it almost
Mm,
suggests that culture belongs to one group of people and others are stealing it. And that plays right into the hands of Hindu nationalists who want to talk about ownership of yoga and
of
basically
course.
suggest that we should all take lessons from Narendra Modi on matters of history and spirituality. And
Yeah,
I'm
which
definitely interested
may
in
not
that.
be the best thing to do, in my advice. But I think you have the same kind of contradictions and paradoxes or confusions, if you like, arising from Tibetan Buddhism and
Yes.
the journey of Tibetan Buddhism to the West, and particularly in America. You can see out of that has evolved a very Americanized form of Tibetan Buddhism,
Yeah.
which incorporates a lot of the central teachings, but at the same time has been very critical of sort of the patriarchal system of lamas in ancient Tibet, has led to all sorts of difficulties and confusions and scandals about
Mhm.
Tibetan Buddhist teachers, perhaps not understanding that things that might have been appropriate in one culture are not appropriate in this culture. Um, and that is, I think, has been very, very damaging in many ways to Tibetan Buddhism. Um, so, yeah, these things are not easy. They're not easy. But things morph and things change, and the culture changes. There is no fixed point in any of these things. I think so you can never go back and say, well, this is the point at which it's the right thing.
No, exactly. And Buddhism's a great example of that. I mean, obviously it started in India, but would that make Zen Buddhism by the time it gets to Japan via being Chun Buddhism in China somehow corrupted, or is it just its own thing, influenced by Japanese traditions as much as by Indian traditions, in the same way that
Exactly.
Chinese Buddhism intersects with Taoism and Confucianism and goodness knows what else. So it's
Exactly.
understandable American Buddhism is going to have
It's
distinctive
going to have its own
American
flavor. Yeah, it's going to
characteristics.
have its
Yeah.
own flavor, its own texture. It's going to want to throw out some things and incorporate other things, and there's going to be a lot of sort of a lot of difficulties and a lot of soul searching, involved in that. And we've seen that over the last 20 or 30 years, I think. Yeah. I've written about that a little bit, not so much in books, but in my journalism, looking at the case of people like Sogyal Rinpoche,
Yeah.
and the scandals that arose around Sogyal Rinpoche, which is, again, something very, very interesting to me. The degree to which patently he was abusing the license, if you like, that came with being to a large degree a self-styled Tibetan Buddhist master, the misunderstandings that arose from that, but also the defensiveness among his closest associates and followers and disciples when the true nature of the man was revealed, and the desperate attempt to kind of cling on to a vision of him as the sort of perfect master. But then again, this is something else that's symptomatic of when so-called perfect masters are revealed to have feet of clay. It's always very difficult for devotees to recognize that and come to terms with that, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. For those who aren't so familiar, could you give us a little summary of the story of Sogyal? He's quite a striking character and case study, as you say.
Yeah, well, he came to Britain sometime in the 60s, I want to say, maybe the 70s, and there's some doubt about his credentials to being a lama, or it certainly came.
Mm.
Not disabusing people of the belief that he might have been a lama, and they probably best known for writing a book called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which was a
Although, did he
huge.
actually write it?
Well, this is you took the words out of my mouth. So this was actually seems to have been written, literally written by Andrew Harvey, who's a very interesting guy, very, very nice guy. I've met Andrew and like him very much. And Patrick Gaffney, who was very close to Sogyal Rinpoche and effectively became his sort of, for want of a better word, his sort of right-hand man within Rigpo, which is Sogyal Rinpoche's organization. And then towards the end of the 90s, the allegations began to arise that Sogyal Rinpoche was taking advantage of his position and sleeping with female devotees. And while there is no prescription against him sleeping with female devotees, he seemed to be sleeping with rather too many female devotees to justify his claim that they were his sort of consorts, or that this was some part of their journey along the path to enlightenment. There was a case in America which was settled out of court, but then these rumblings continued until about 3 or 4 years ago. A group of his followers signed a sort of collective letter making all sorts of pretty heinous allegations about him, which were demonstrably true, and resulted in him sort of resigning from the organization. And yeah, it was a kind of ghastly situation, and brought no. This is what distresses me, that it brought no credit to Tibetan Buddhism in the West whatsoever, and it gives a lot of people completely the wrong impression of that. But it's a salutary, I think, experience, a salutary lesson in what's been described as Shangri-La syndrome. This idea that Westerners have that anything that emanates from the East sort of comes down from a mountaintop wreathed in rainbows and wonderfulness and magic and mystery. Um, and that's not always the case, and of course the last 50 or so years is full of charlatans of one stripe or another who've taken advantage of that belief and exploited that belief. But that's not to say that while some gurus may be charlatans, it doesn't mean all gurus are charlatans. Quite the opposite, I think.
Well, it seems that Sogyal was probably, modeling himself on Chogyam Trungpa, who had, a few years earlier done pretty much the same thing, except he had credentials and he did seem
Very
to have
much.
something to communicate and was quite skillful at doing it, as well as being an alcoholic philanderer who wound
Yeah,
up in an early grave.
it's a difficult question. This, I mean, wearing my musical hat, music writer's hat,
Mm.
I wrote a book about Phil Spector,
Yes.
who of course was subsequently convicted of murder. And of course, at the time, a lot of people said, "Well, I can no longer play Be My Baby," or "I'm a rebel," or "You've lost that loving feeling." And it sort of, in that case, it poses the question, well, are you a genius or are you a murderer? Well, the rather confusing fact is you can be both things. You can be both a genius
Mm.
and a murderer. And in Chogyam Trungpa's case, you can be both an alcoholic and a philanderer and an extraordinarily gifted teacher of Tibetan Buddhism.
Mm.
And the two don't necessarily cancel each other out. And it's up to you, the individual, to make your mind up about how you reconcile that in your own mind and what you take and what you leave.
Indeed, yeah, and I think the moment in which Sogyal finally got his comeuppance was sort of one where nuance was not in fashion. It was everything's either good or bad suddenly, and he perhaps was bad enough to be cast out in the bad camp,
I think
but
he
it
was bad.
became all I was trying to say was it was very difficult around that time to talk even about people like Chogyam Trungpa in that sort of balanced way.
Yeah,
It would be very easy to be accused of being a victim blamer or an apologist for all sorts of unsavory ways of thinking about things to suggest that he had redeeming qualities. And I saw this a lot in other aspects of the yoga and meditation world. There were a number of gurus who around that time were being exposed for things that had been open secrets within their communities for a long time,
yes.
often posthumously. And it was difficult because obviously a lot of people had got a lot of benefit out of studying with these characters,
Yeah, well,
and
that's the parallel. I don't know, I was having a conversation with somebody today about this very thing, about Sai Baba, who again was venerated, at one time, and was sort of the great living saint of India, and was subsequently undone by the usual thing, sexual scandal. Um, but again, at the same time, through people's devotion to Sai Baba came a hospital, irrigation projects. A lot of people were perhaps encouraged and steered towards leading very ethical, pure, holy lives as a result of their engagement with him and with his teachings. Uh, and then he turns out to be something that they didn't think he was. And again, as I was referring to earlier, along with that comes a lot of denial. Well, no, it's all a misunderstanding. And don't people realize that this was part of the practice and it's all been cooked up by his enemies and so on and so forth? Which I don't think was the case. Again, I wrote a pretty extensive investigation into Sai Baba, and I don't think these things were cooked up. But these are difficult questions. But I think, to my mind, one of the most interesting questions that has arisen in this whole engagement between East and West. But there's no answer to it, and it's up to people to come up with their own answer to it.
which leads me actually to you mentioned Andrew Harvey, a sort of episode you describe in The Spiritual Tourist involving his relationship with Mother Meera, who
Mm.
is an Indian teacher in Germany who seems to. I mean, I don't quite know the chronology. I've not read Andrew's book, but is this predating his involvement with Sogyal, or is it sort of contemporaneous?
I think it's more or less contemporaneous. Yeah, I think at that point, Andrew was very much, engaged across a whole variety of subjects in this world. Trying to think about what the chronology would be. He wrote a wonderful book. Is it called A Journey in Ladakh?
He did write
Which,
that, yeah.
yeah, which I think was his first. I think that was his first book. Youngest ever Fellow of All Souls, Oxford, which is
Wow, yeah.
pretty extraordinary accomplishment. Very bright, very engaging man. And then became a very ardent devotee of Mother Mirror, and wrote a book, Hidden Journey, about that. And again, subsequently became disillusioned because Andrew is gay, and Mother Mirror so one's led to believe, took a very disapproving view of this, and Andrew couldn't reconcile the love for his partner with Mother Mirror's conservative Hinduism, which is basically what I guess underpinned her view of that. But I did go and visit her, and that was a rather extraordinary experience. And clearly there was something very, perhaps is. I haven't been there for many years, but there was, in my experience, something very special about her, and I had a very powerful experience. What she would do is she would hold a darshan, a sort of silent darshan, and people would go in front of her and kneel in front of her, and then she would just hold your head in her hands and sort of hold your gaze for a little while. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And I came away from that, my cheeks burning, feeling very flushed, and feeling quite heady. I wouldn't say it was a Sartori experience or a sort of instant enlightenment experience, but I did feel as if I was sort of floating on air for quite a long time, and went back to the little guest house where I was staying, and was still feeling it, and woke up when I woke up the next morning, and made the journey back to Frankfurt, got on a plane, came into the telegraph offices with a big smile on my face, and I'm sure people were thinking, what are you smiling about? It would have been too complicated to explain why I was smiling. But it didn't persuade me to become a follower of Mother Mirror or a disciple of Mother Mirror. And I know it's something that comes with the territory. But one of the things that was there at the little house in Talheim where Mother Mirror was, there was the kind of the bookstall and the badges with her face on, and I don't want to say it was a sort of mini Rajneesh kind of operation, but certainly there was a degree of commercialization behind it. But I suppose if people become followers, they want to wear a badge or have some sort of token of belonging or some token of connection. But I've never felt that with anybody, really. Well, I do have a red and blue scarf when I go to see Crystal Palace play at Saturday afternoon, but that's the closest I've ever come, really, to any kind of affiliation.
You don't have a religious commitment then of any kind?
Well, I do. I've started in the last 2 or 3 years, perhaps a little longer, going to Holy Communion each Sunday morning in a lovely little chapel, 18th century chapel where I live, and I do find an interesting and a rewarding sense of kind of community from that. Not that I was lacking community. I have a wonderful community of friends and colleagues and so forth, but a particular kind of community. I always like listening to the sermon and like the gospel reading, and the congregation is old enough and small enough that if you go 3 or 4 times, you're inevitably going to be asked to sort of do something. And so I've been asked, my wife and I we're asked to become sidesmen. So once every 4 or 5 weeks, we go and open up the chapel and lay out the altar and tidy up afterwards and so forth. And I don't ask me about the theology, but and I do find that very rewarding, and I feel it's interesting. I noticed that you'd written something about Jack Kerouac, and you were quite interested in Jack Kerouac. And that took me back actually to something in my book that I'd written about Kerouac. Because one of the things that attracted me about Kerouac, or that appeals to me about Kerouac, is that his Buddhism came sort of marinated, as it were, well, marinated in alcohol, but steeped very much also in his kind of cradle Catholicism. And there's a passage that I quote, which is his in Mexico City Blues. I don't know if you remember this, but it's a recitation he makes of the saints. I believe in the sweetness of Jesus and Buddha. I believe in St. Francis Avaliki. So that kind of ecumenicalism, you know. So I guess if anything, I'd be a sort of pantheistic ecumenicalist agnostic, if such a thing exists. You know, I can see the value in. I feel very drawn to Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, and to some of the extraordinary people and the extraordinary teachings that I've encountered in that. I think, you know, I'm drawn to the extraordinary teachings of Christ. I think you can be many things, can't you? Can you take a pluralistic view? I feel I can anyway.
Well, fair enough. I mean, I think we can all do as makes sense to us, frankly. Yeah, to come up with a cliched response, it's a free country. I mean, especially, you know, the realm within. That's where real sovereignty is found. And so, you know, what makes sense and what works is all to be encouraged, I think. And at the same time, you know, from a sort of scholarly perspective, there was, you know, an enormous fashion around 100 years ago for making it all fit together into the same thing. And Aldous
Right.
Huxley, perhaps, you know, most famously with his
Oh yeah.
perennial philosophy, giving the sort of
Yeah.
umbrella terminology for it.
I love that book.
And
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you know, it's very comforting to think that, but then at the same
Yeah.
time, there is also distinction, and one can get, you know, confused by going too far in either direction. I think to always, you know, try and differentiate everything, or to always try and collapse it all into the same thing. Um,
Hmm.
so I like to try and sort of preserve a bit of a balance between those things, and to see in some way something being the organizing framework into which other things are kind of borrowed in because they're helpful. Otherwise, I sort of don't really know where I'm going with something. And I guess I speak from the point of view of having to figure this out as a yoga practitioner. And people
Sure.
used to tell me you should only have one teacher and you should follow one tradition. And I never did any of that. I always dabbled. But I would always get confused unless I was sort of borrowing things from one place and organizing them in, you know, the basic framework that I got from another place. If it was sort of all up for grabs, then I wouldn't really know where I was going. And I think coming back to sort of the beginning of it all, we as Westerners, for the most part, have been raised culturally Christian without
Yeah.
really realizing it, without
Yeah.
really having, in fact, any more the vocabulary or the deep understanding of symbols to make sense of what that's all about. And yet it's
Yes.
there, you know, there's this aspects of the calendar, the architecture, the, you know, the sort of I mean, anything written before, you know, about 150 years ago is deeply steeped in this stuff. And yet, you know, we're sort of a bit adrift from it because hardly anybody would call themselves, you know, a fully signed up believer these days in terms of
That's true.
percentage of the population. And so that's where a lot of people got, yeah, the sense of being a bit adrift and attracted to the Eastern world. And I suppose there's something about the way you devised the structure of the book, Nirvana Express, that made me wonder about this. You called the first half the book and the second half the sacrament. And it seemed that Westerners, you know, raised in this cultural Christian context, had had enough of the religion of the book and they wanted the experience. They didn't want to hear about Jesus. They wanted to be Jesus. And there was
That's a
something
really
of
good
that
way. That's a
available.
really yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah. I think there was a rejection of. Well, I mean, there's a lot going on, isn't there? At the end of the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, a rejection of dogma, I think, is one thing, and a sort of an embrace of science and the way in which
Of
science is
course.
beginning to question sort of Christian teachings and sort of absolutist Christian teachings, and at the same time, of course, because of colonialism. This stuff is beginning to filter in from the east. You know, stories about gurus and religious practices and Buddhism, and uh, I mean, Edwin Arnold wrote The Light of Asia in what, 1879?
I think that's right. Yeah.
It was, I mean, it's a huge success. I mean, who would have thought that? It sold more than 1 million copies. A prose poem about the Buddha selling more than 1 million copies. You certainly wouldn't find that now, for sure. But I think there was this tremendous fascination at that time with the East, and this perennial fascination with the other. And I think that's always something that underpins this kind of interest. You know, people live in a hermetically sealed world, but there's always a curiosity about the other. What's going on in the other world? What's going on elsewhere? And is there something there that I can learn? Is there something there that I can draw from? So I think you have that confluence of ideas that are happening at the end of the 19th century. And The Light of Asia is the book that you refer to and that I refer to. And the sacrament, I was thinking of that as being LSD, which is the sort of the gateway drug, literally the gateway drug to a lot of people of that time. A lot of people at that time becoming immersed in Eastern philosophy through Aldous Huxley, Doors of Perception, through Timothy Leary, through Ginsberg. You know, this idea of you can have the instant religious experience, the instant transcendental experience, which Leary, of course, you know, is the high priest of psychedelia. That was very much his message. I write in the book about this to me very interesting sort of moment that Timothy Leary has when he's experimented with psychedelics and with LSD, but he goes to this Hindu ashram in Boston, run by a man named Fred Swain, who was a U.S. Army officer who'd become a Vedanta monk, and they sort of take LSD as part of it, literally as part of the sacrament. And the way Leary describes this is everything around him turns into this extraordinary sort of Hindu vision, and he starts seeing all these Hindu gods and goddesses, and he actually says, you know, I am a Hindu now. You know, we're all Hindus now, and I think there was that sort of collective sort of said. Leary is really interesting because he has this very sort of he so typifies what was going on in the 60s, because he has this kind of oh wow vision of what Indian religion is, Indian spirituality is. You know, he goes to Varanasi, doesn't he? And he describes it as like a sort of a non-stop hippie festival, been going on for the last 500 years. You know, it's bearded, ragged mystics and tripped out sadhus and Leary himself wandering around completely spaced out, loving all this and thinking this is all fantastic. And I think that's probably the idea that a lot of people who clambered into their VW combi buses and trekked across Europe to India, I think that's very much the vision that they had of India, that this was a place of instant enlightenment and instant trippiness, and they didn't quite imagine they'd end up with their passport stolen, sitting on a street corner in Delhi begging for money to get home. But that was part of the experience as well.
Yes, experience, I think, is the key word, isn't it? And your book ends, so I don't want to give away anything about the ending, but with a character you interviewed talking about, you know, it was all a good experience despite everything going horribly wrong.
Despite everything. Yeah. Well, you can give that away. I mean, yeah. I mean, that's someone talking about the Bhagwan, talking about Osho.
Rajneesh Puram.
Yeah, Osho as he's now. Does anybody now refer to him as Rajneesh? Surely nobody that
I
goes.
think that probably dates you, or suggests you've watched Wild Wild Country on Netflix, one or the other.
Well, I wrote the book before Wild Wild Country, so can't accuse me of that. But certainly that name was completely expunged. I mean, once Rajneesh sort of declared that he was now Osho, the person that had been Rajneesh with all the baggage attached of Rolls Royces and expensive wristwatches and armed guards patrolling sort of the borders of Rajneesh Puram, you know, all of that was kind of consigned to the dustbin of history, never to be mentioned again. So that disavowal is very interesting. But still, I mean, I've not been there, and maybe I should have been, but there is still a sort of Osho almost like a spiritual tourist camp in Pune, from my understanding.
It is
Uh,
exactly that way. Yeah. I mean, I've not actually been inside. I've got as far as the gate and didn't want to pay the
right,
fee and go in for an HIV test, which is the
right,
price of entry. But
right.
I was studying at the Iyengar Yoga Institute, which is also in Pune, and yeah, I thought I'd
Oh,
go for the
okay.
sightseeing. And it is exactly as you describe. It's a sort of upscale Club Med style, kind of lie on the sun lounges and wander off to all various kinds of spiritual knickknacks and get a
Yeah.
massage afterwards. Hmm.
So what do you feel about that? Do you feel that's, I mean, do you sort of, you're not a man who scorns anything, I can tell, but do you feel a sort of mild disapproval or sadness about that? Or do you feel, oh, that's fair enough. If people want to go and do a Reiki session or a meditation session or whatever, fair enough. Or do you feel, well, actually, there's probably a little bit of commercial exploitation going on there, and they're trading on the name of Osho, and
I mean, it's a complex mix, isn't it, really? I think the simplest way of answering would be to say it isn't for me. But at the same time, the whole world of spiritual traditions has its commercial chaos going on. Been to
hmm,
jump back to something we were discussing earlier in relation to Sogyal and his sort of passing himself off as a lama. There
right,
was a lot in the cachet that could be gained from getting notorious and getting followers and getting donations to the extent that somebody like the Dalai Lama, who knew very well that this guy was a fraud, was prepared to talk him up.
that's
And
right. Well, certainly not to register his disapproval of him. Yeah.
well,
It's,
did he not write a foreword to one of his books, if I remember rightly, or have I got that wrong?
um, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. But certainly at a time when it was pretty well known what Sogyal was doing. And in fact, at one point, a delegation of yoga teachers, or Buddhist teachers, I should say, went to Dharamsala and talked to the Dalai Lama about this. And he sort of took a very much a kind of hands off kind of approach to it. Of course, the Dalai Lama he's not the Pope. He's not in charge of Tibetan Buddhism. He's not the
No.
Archbishop of Canterbury in charge of sort of Anglicanism or whatever. And Tibetan Buddhist lamas have always tended to go their own way. And of course, there's a long, noble history of sort of factionalism and dispute and even sort of armed conflict between schools of Tibetan Buddhism going back centuries. So again, that's a very complex. Everything's complicated in this world. It's what makes it so rich and fascinating.
Well, I suppose, yeah, to come back then, I mean, that is a whole rabbit hole in itself if we go any further with the Dalai Lama and Sogyal. But coming back to the more simple question of Osho and, the spiritual tourist park, um, I think the fundamental message of these traditions is that there's a problem that causes suffering, and that problem is located in the mind, and the nature of the problem is self-centeredness.
Mhm.
And therefore, the way out of the problem is to diminish attachment to, self-importance,
Yeah,
self-satisfaction, self-gratification, and to really cultivate a very simple attitude to life and an inner peace and contentment with things as they are, without constant striving to make them any particular way. And so, therefore, something that's all about, catering to, consumer satisfaction, which is not exclusive to the Osho theme park. It's the spiritual marketplace of the 21st century. Everything from Gwyneth Paltrow's scented candles to, overpriced yoga classes, more than 20 quid these days in London to drop in for one.
right,
It's all a bit complex. It's often about feeding people with products that make them feel good because you need to get them to pay. And so
yeah,
subtly, very slowly, the boundaries get blurred and it starts to
right,
be all about me and what I want and
exactly. So
did,
it's the
did I did
complete,
I get what I paid for?
exactly. So it's the complete contradiction of
Exactly.
what these disciplines and belief systems actually espouse.
But of
Yeah,
course, you find plenty of that in India on display from Indian gurus, and just somebody like Sai Baba with his watch manifestation, or Rajneesh with his fleet of Rolls Royces.
yeah,
Clearly they got the same bug.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's
I did
materialism,
think
not spirituality.
when I went to the Sai Baba Ashram myself, and spent some time there, and I felt quite repelled by it actually. This sort of pastel pink and blue series of palaces, and the devotions which I found, and everybody saying Sai Ram, and I didn't like it, and it did make me think that actually the probably the best thing that any guru, the best symbol of any guru would be a simple tree. You know, be done with ashrams, be done with ornate buildings, be done with armies of attendants, be done with all of that. And I mean, I'm speaking very idealistically, obviously, but that's something actually that appeals to me about Ramana Maharshi, is just the simplicity with which he lived, you know, throughout his whole life. And we can talk endlessly about Ramana Maharshi and what he embodied and what he was teaching. But one thing that he does embody is that simplicity, that completely unadorned embodiment of his own philosophy, or of that philosophy, and of the numerous different people that I write about in the Nirvana Express. I think he was one I felt most sort of drawn to, in a way. Him and the tragedy of Jack Kerouac, to be back where we started. I've always had a great affection for Jack Kerouac, and a great sadness about his sadness, really. So Kerouac and Ramana Maharshi, I should say, are those the two poles of the things that I love most about all this.
That simplicity, I think, is very important, and it takes me back to where I was going to go with Andrew Harvey and Mother Mira about half an hour ago. And after he had sort of been disillusioned, I suppose, and decided, you know, he didn't really want anything to do with her anymore, you quote him as saying something very interesting. I don't have the phrase to hand, but it was something along the lines of whatever I thought I was getting through my association with her is very real. But it was in me, and it was an experience that I had. It didn't come from her. And so the facilitation that a teacher can provide might be the, you know, creation of the potential for that to happen. But at the same time, whatever happens is not coming externally from a practitioner. It's just their inner experience. And
Yeah,
that can also be accessed in any other way. And you know, the simplest parallel to this is to go back to the drugs example. And you can take all manner of substances, they'll have all manner of effects. But in the end, all that's happening is brain chemistry. And
yeah,
it's possible to sit on a cushion and have the brain chemistry kick off the same thing in the same way. And I've been on meditation retreats and experienced, you know, intense sort of reenactments of various states I'd experienced in other ways, just from this is the brain doing its thing. And so there's I think a realization that he was describing there that does seem very important, which is teachers are only helpful up to a point, and another message that was coming elsewhere in the book was often that there isn't that much to teach. This is all
right.
very simple in the end. It's just an appreciation for, you know, the preciousness of life, and
Yeah,
you know, the simplicity of just being here without, you know, getting all entangled in this, you know, sort of greedy little machine in the mind that, you know, distorts everything, and also without getting lost in this, you know, obsession with the body, which, you know, is terrified of dying, and instead just to be alive while we're here and, you know, each moment actually be in it. Um, if everybody was able to just do that, that would already be quite a lot. And there's no need to find a teacher for that necessarily, but it's very hard to get out of our own way. And
no,
so,
that's true. Yeah, and the teacher isn't whatever the teacher is doing is actually, it's you awakening something in you. It's coming from you. It's not coming from them. I mean, I'm going to go off at a complete tangent here, but it's just something that's been in my mind because I've been writing about it. I've been writing about this canonization of this 15-year-old boy called Carlo Acutis, who is next year is going to be canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church. And looking into that, and looking to the two miracles that are required for beatification and then finally for canonization. And so looking at those miracles and thinking about those a lot. And what am I thinking about those? I mean, it's a bigger question and a very complex question. But whatever is happening and clearly something is happening in terms of those cures. You might call them miraculous, you might call them coincidence, but they are certainly beyond scientific. There's no scientific explanation for them. But one would have to conclude they are coming from the person who is praying, and it's the faith that their prayer embodies, which is affecting the cure. That's what I would say about those. I mean, that's something very random, different from what you're talking about in terms of the simplicity of life.
I don't know at all, actually. I think you've hit on something very important there. The mind is very powerful, and this sincerity of commitment to something
Yeah,
can have transformative effects.
exactly. And yeah, I believe that very, very, very much, very much.
I mean, if we to take it back to the scientific explanation, words like placebo would come into the mix, perhaps. But the power of the placebo is not to be underestimated. And
No.
a lot of GPs provide a great service by helping people just to go home and stop worrying about their conditions and get on with their lives. And obviously, you can take that to very extreme manifestations whereby people find a way to heal themselves from things that are attacking their body, because in the
Yeah.
end it is just about something some resources inside get marshaled, and some inner strength is there. And the yoga philosophy, it's same as the Buddhist teachings on this, is a sort of precondition for seeing very clearly. Start with the idea that you can't develop strength, which will lead to progress on the path, without some degree of faith. And that faith doesn't have to be, believing in miracles or rainbows and unicorns. It's literally this conviction that there is some, point to persevering in this way.
Yeah.
And if you have that, then many things are possible. And if you
Yeah.
don't have that, it's very hard to get anywhere.
Yeah. One of the things, I mean, you mentioned earlier on this this rather sort of bizarre gallery of people that I talk about in the book, from Somerset Maugham to Mercedes D'Acosta, Hollywood screenwriter, and Paul Brunton. There's a whole kind of cast of them in the book. And one of the things I found actually in writing about this, and it's interesting because I mean, the book, and I'm very grateful, has been very generously reviewed, and reviewers seem to like it. But some people have sort of seen it as a kind of riotous, rib-tickling kind of account of sort of fools and charlatans, which I don't think it is, and certainly didn't intend it to be. But one of the things I found it very moving, these people's stories, and I was very moved by their yearning for something more, and by their kind of courage in going out and sort of exploring it, and traveling to India and encountering these sages and these saints, and sometimes charlatans, but which wouldn't have been half as easy in the 1920s and 30s as it is now. I mean, they couldn't get on a plane and fly to Pune. Probably you can get a direct flight to Pune. I don't know. There's something rather touching about this, and in many ways they may seem sort of strange characters, sometimes sort of quite bizarre characters. Some of their beliefs may seem somewhat eccentric, but at the heart is that kind of quest and that determination, and that yearning for something beyond themselves, that yearning for a greater understanding of the world, a greater understanding of themselves. And I find that very touching and very moving.
Really appreciate you saying that, and it leads me to wonder why that wasn't part of the book. Because comparing the Nirvana Express with the Spiritual Tourist, the big difference between them is, the earlier book, you were a character in it, and
Yeah.
it's a sort of first-person exploration. I wouldn't call it gonzo in the sense that you're not sort of off on a bender, but you're sampling the merchandise.
Yeah.
You're
I
definitely
didn't
going
have my
out.
lawyer with me like Hunter Thompson as I was cruising across the Nevada desert. That's for sure.
But
Uh,
at the same time, in this new book, I don't know. I mean, it's not that you treat all these characters with great respect, but the author is missing, and it's not clear necessarily what your position is, in relation to the whole endeavor of seeking. Um, there is a sensitivity in the way that you tell their stories. It's clear that you have some sympathy for several of the characters, um, quite evidently in the way that you talk about them. But I wonder, was there a conscious choice made to leave yourself out of it this time?
I kind of felt that it's interesting you should pick up on that. I mean, I did feel I sort of said enough about myself. Nobody wants to read about me, and I said enough about myself in The Spiritual Tourist, really.
Mhm.
And I mean, with this book, because I'd written about some of these characters and written about some of the times in a pretty discursive kind of way. What I wanted to do with this book was actually to explore in more detail, the history behind this engagement. So in that sense, it's certainly not an academic book, um, but it's much more a narrative of the history. And I the more I read about that, the more I wanted to tell that through this cast of different characters, because I wanted it to be an entertainment. I didn't want it to be a dull recitation of and then and then and then. I wanted to tell the story as you very perceptively said. It is about people passing the baton in a way from this extraordinary character of Edwin Arnold, and tracing that through the 20s and 30s, and then the Beatles and LSD, and up to Osho, as I shall now have to force myself to call him. So yeah, I didn't feel there was a place for me in the book, and that if I was too much in the book, that it would kind of get in the way of these other characters whose voices were struggling to be heard in the book. So that's the reason why.
I mean, I can see that from the way it's structured. I suppose the only place you could be perhaps would be, there's a preface, a very brief one. It sort of lays out the stall of, why are we going to go back to the late 19th century? But I wondered maybe a sort of epilogue, kind of here's my view on it. I suppose the main reason that it occurred to me was I like to read end notes, being a little bit scholarly, and I think you
Yeah.
may have written the longest end note I have ever encountered, involving an exchange of emails you had with somebody working for Bhagavan Das,
Oh
trying to
yeah,
hustle you for money for an interview, and
that's right.
that exchange, printed in full, it almost warranted being pulled out as a case study of like, okay, and the sort of sincerity of your desire to engage with him, contrasting with the sort
Yeah,
of blatant, materialism of this supposed
yeah,
spiritual character in
yeah, yeah.
response.
The price would multiply by about 100-fold in the year that I failed to be in contact with him. Yeah, no. Well, there we are. Well, I hope that speaks for itself. I should have kept that. I should have taken that out of the end notes and had it as a separate chapter. Really, I mean, I think.
I almost wonder, yeah, because I
But
think, there's
I'm glad you found it in the end notes, and I hope people do find it in the end notes because it is a funny story. Um,
it's,
and I'm like you actually. I love notes, and very often I find the notes more interesting and engaging than what they've originally referred to. So I always read notes in books. Um, but anyway, but I'm glad you enjoyed it, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I suppose the reason I mentioned it was going back to the spiritual tourist on the back cover. You got some amazing blurbs here. You got one from Sting saying you've written the perfect balance between rational skepticism and spiritual longing. So, in a way, it would just from the point of view of you in that anecdote, it seemed to me the perfect balance between you're skeptical and yet you're still trying to get this guy to tell you some stories about the good old days.
No, that's
And
come
then
on. I'm a journalist. You got to persevere. You put your
Well, true,
what,
true,
what
true.
can I
But
say?
you're not just a journalist, and that's what the other blurb from Robert Pirsig, no less, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He says you basically take everybody in there on this sort of journalist's quest, which is yeah, instantly able to see through all the shams, but you don't just stop at the his exposure of the sham. You keep going, and you keep trying to say, well, what's there behind all this? What need is being catered to by this behavior? What is it that people are trying to fulfill by persevering with it? And, at the very end of the book, you show through your own experience. So, I think that I suppose that's why I was moved to use the phrase gonzo, just in the sense that you go on a journey, literally. It's nice sometimes to keep that there. Although I do understand this is a completely different book. I suppose I was just such a fan of the first one that I
Oh,
was rooting
God,
rooting for in the
oh,
mix at the end.
you
The
want more
violins come
exposure? Yeah, come on, tell us more about yourself. No, no, I'm very, I mean, what I wrote at the end of the Spiritual Tourist is very much what I felt at that time, and I think probably represents very clearly what I feel now. And as I said at the beginning of our conversation, I admire you enormously, and I admire the fact that you found a path, and you've pursued a path, and you've done that rigorously and with discipline. A, I don't have the discipline, but B, I think it's just the person I am. I'm I don't know whether I'm interested in things because I'm a journalist, or became a journalist because I'm interested in things, but my perspective has always been a journalistic one, and while that has taken me into some extraordinary situations, and I've met many extraordinary people, and I've led an incredibly blessed life, and I've been incredibly privileged. I suppose the sort of the deeper quest, the deeper inner quest, I still have a lot of unanswered questions about that, and but I found, I think I found where my sort of satisfaction lies, and where my contentment lies. I should put it in that way. And whatever I say about that is going to sound a mixture of the sort of simplistic, the overly pious, the sort of the idiotic. But it's I'll say it anyway. But it's in family, it's in friendship, it's in it's in the nuts and bolts of life that make us what we are, that make us human beings. And as you say, the awareness of not to become attached to, or dragged down by all the sort of the external things about materialism, about looking back over your shoulder all the time, or looking fearfully towards the future. That's enough moralizing from me.
That sounds a very inspiring note on which to end, but I don't want to quite end there, because I first want to note actually that one of the few negative comments that anybody ever manages to make about Ramana Maharshi, which you quote in the book, is it's a bit world renouncing, isn't it? All of this, just sort of sit there and don't do anything. There's nothing to do. Just figure out who you are, and there is a life beyond that, and there's a world out there, and
Yeah,
engaging in it is valuable. And how
yeah,
we engage, informed by that wisdom, is what's really important.
yeah. And I think that's right. I mean, that's Paul Brunton who said that, who was very much deeply enamored, if that's the right word, of Ramana Maharshi, and having been disillusioned by Meher Baba, who was the first sort of guru or swami that he encountered, was clearly deeply touched and affected by Ramana Maharshi, but then had this, as you say, this sort of realization, or came to this conclusion that one does have to sort of engage with the world. And so, what does that beg the question? I mean, we can't all, we're not all going to become Ramana Maharshi,
Exactly.
sitting on a divan on a tiger skin in a loincloth, passing the days in a state of samadhi, because the world would stop if we did that. So, from someone who is very much engaged in the world as I am, and engaged with the world as I am, that certainly wouldn't be either an appealing or practical solution to me. But I think we need the Ramana Maharshis of this world, and I think we need those kind of exemplars of an ideal, if you like, and of a kind of spiritual ideal, and a philosophical idea. And the two things aren't mutually exclusive, are they? I mean, you can be a saint, and you can be a saint meditating and sitting on the divan on a tiger skin, and at the same time you can be a saint feeding the poor. There's a wonderful quote, and I wish I could remember it. I was just in Assisi writing about this Italian saint to be. There's a wonderful quote by the biographer, the 14th century, 15th century biographer of Francis of Assisi. And he says, oh yes, he says he was as greedy for poverty as others are for riches, which is an extraordinary kind of description of St. Francis, as greedy for poverty as others are for riches. So there's one ideal of a saint in the Catholic tradition. And Ramana Maharshi is another ideal in the Vedantic tradition. But yeah, I mean, you've got to live in the world, haven't you? You live in the world. I live in the world. We all live in the world. So I can see where Paul Brunton was coming from in his criticism of it.
Me too. And at the same time, I do think having the beacon out there, I'm very glad there are still some people who really go all the way with this stuff,
Yeah.
or at least as far as one can, so that the likes of me can go and ask them for some guidance. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I'd be asking myself, and I'm not always my best source of advice. So that leads me to the final question, really, which is to come to the end of the book. You talk about Rajneesh, in all of his Technicolor glory and horror show extremes. And the chapter about him is titled "The Last Guru," and the book sort of suggests really that it's not possible actually anymore to put on that sort of show and get away with it. But I wonder, on the one hand, are we really done with the age of the guru in the West, or has the sort of embodiment of that shifted somewhat, and it's now Instagram influencers? It's a character I can think of by the name of Jay Shetty. I don't know if you've come across.
Yeah, I have come across. Yeah, I mean, I've not met him personally, but I know who you mean by Jay Shetty. Yeah, yeah.
Similarly, kind of questionable in some ways, but
Yeah.
influential in others.
Yeah, so is Jay Shetty the Rajneesh of today? Is he the Maharishi?
Who knows?
Maharishi of today? I mean, I deliberately called it The Last Guru because I think the end of him, although he continues in a way that, as we've discussed, but that sort of that Rajneesh period, it does bring to an end that sort of period in the almost between the sort of the late 19th century to the end of the 80s. Where I think that trajectory, that infatuation with gurus, that infatuation with the East, that infatuation with sort of, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but with that interest, I should say. I think maybe you're right. It does take a different form, and of course there are gurus in India still, and there are Westerners going to see gurus in India, and there are many Westerners still going to the Ramana Maharshi ashram and
Indeed.
Going to, not to Rishikesh because the Maharishi ashram doesn't exist anymore. But I'm sure there are any number of ashrams in India where Westerners can go and imbibe and draw on and learn and derive wisdom from. But I think in the sense that it was that cultural explosion, I think perhaps has sort of dissipated somewhat. And I think you're perfectly right in saying perhaps it's a different kind of thing now. It's in a way it's become what we were talking about before. It's become that kind of integration of East and West and the internet age and TikTok and influencers and all of that kind of stuff. And I think the scandals that engulf so many Eastern teachers, after that period of enamoration through the 60s and into the 70s, I think the scandals that followed that, I think, proved very disillusioning to many people. And a lot of people now would look askance and think, Indian guru, you've got to be kidding. I think the damage that was done by the charlatans, I think, has been quite considerable. But it's not to say, of course, that the wisdom is timeless, the wisdom is eternal, the truth is eternal, the truth is timeless, and it's still there to be found.
Thank you, Mick. That's a great place to end. I think, yeah, may we all, in our own way, find some relationship with that.
Absolutely. Listen, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, likewise. Thank you for writing the books and for being such an engaging guest and talking about them. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks
Thank you.
again.